I did you get an email? Did you?
That's David. Yeah, he got an email. I can post it on the chat group if you want.
Yeah. You are live.
I know.
But Stephen, the only one that would want to, you haven't gone live yet.
All right, sound check. Hey, David, how's it going? Can you hear me?
Yeah, Steve, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Uh-oh. You can hear me. I can't hear you.
How about now? Now? Steve, can you hear me?
David, is your mic unmuted?
Yeah. Da, 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 da. Steve, you can't hear me? No? Okay. How does this always,
Hang on here.
how does this
I
always
must
happen?
have an issue with my. Okay, try that again, David.
Can you hear me now?
It's not doing it either. One moment. The speakers are working. Getting sound. It's not getting sound from the Zoom. All right, David, give it
Yeah.
another shot.
Hi, Steve.
Oh, well, still having technical problems on my end. Figures.
Sorry, everyone. One moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll give us feedback. It's not going to work either. David, turn yours on a second. Okay. David,
2, 3. Can you hear us yet, Steve? Just a few moments, and hopefully we'll have things ready to go for you guys.
Hey, everyone, sorry, Steve's getting a technical issue resolved. We'll start very shortly. Steve, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. I had to switch to another computer for some reason.
No worries. You have a camera though?
Coming up.
Ah. There we go.
There we go. We're in action. My apologies. I don't know what happened there, but my own laptop didn't like to play. So we're on Sarah's laptop now, which is fine.
Okay. Steve, you want to get us started?
Sure, absolutely. Well, of course, we're here to discuss the pending Animal Welfare Act regulations of birds. And I'll give a little background on it just to bring everybody up to speed. Just a brief history and kind of where we are right now. Again, so everybody understands the context of what we're dealing with. So the USDA is responsible for enforcing and administering the Animal Welfare Act. The Animal Welfare Act was put in place in 1966 and has changed throughout the years. The important part for us as bird people began in actually 1999 when USDA was sued to add birds, rats, and mice to their coverage. USDA settled that lawsuit and agreed to develop regulations for birds, rats, and mice. They didn't really do anything in that regard for the next 20 years, which brings us basically to today. What happened was in 2019, USDA was sued again because they hadn't put in place these regulations for birds in particular. So the USDA actually lost that lawsuit, and the court ordered them to develop regulations for birds to publish in February of 2022, so last February, to publish a draft set of regulations, which they did. And by this February 24th, I believe is the date, they are supposed to publish their final draft of the regulations. So at this point, we don't know specifically what the regulations will say, but we have a couple things to go by. First of all, we have the proposed draft regulations that were published last February. And we also have the existing regulations for mammals. So we have a pretty good idea if we go by the existing regulations for mammals and look at the draft regulations that were published this past February. So basically what we're looking at for birds, the USDA is going to require a license for the Animal Welfare Act for anybody that wholesales birds. So there's a retail exemption that I'll get into just a little bit more in a minute. But basically they're looking for licensing of wholesalers of birds, anybody that displays birds to the public for money. And that doesn't matter whether it's donated money or, you know, admission fees like a zoo. You have to be licensed to do that. If you're paid to transport birds, you would also need to be licensed.
Steve, sorry, not to cut you off, but I feel like you're winding up to go a long ways off. So do you want me to take over at this point?
If you want, I can wrap it up pretty quick. There's just a couple of things. Are you going to cover the retail exemption and how that works?
Yeah, I was going to.
Okay, I'll leave that for you. And the de minimis exemptions.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave that for you because that's right where I was headed. So if you want to take the ball and go into that in a little bit more detail, that would be great.
Okay. All right. So just briefly, everyone I'm sure knows Steve because you know he's our bird papa. But for those who don't know us, for those who don't know me, I'm David Garcia. I'm the organization of professional aviculturists. I'm their attorney, their pro bono attorney. I'm a fully licensed lawyer in Florida and New Jersey. I practice in front of the federal courts regularly. I went to Georgetown University Law Center, and I now handle private practice in Florida. And on top of all that, I'm a bird breeder. I have a small collection, 100 pairs, and I have a small collection of birds. So, I'm not just an attorney. I'm also going to be someone who's going to have to get a license, just like all of you guys. Steve, I'm gonna share my PowerPoint just so everyone doesn't have to be staring at me and you while we talk, and I'll go through that like quickly. So. So to recap, Steve was 100% correct. These three organizations, the American Anti-Vivisection Society, PETA, and the Avian Welfare Coalition, all sued USDA about the birds, about regulations under the Animal Welfare Act for birds, how they hadn't implemented them, and that's how we got here. So as much as we want to be mad at the USDA for putting this on us, it's really, they didn't want to. It was these three groups who forced them to do it. And the final rules are going to come out. So when we have a real final idea of what's going on is February 22nd, 2023. That's when they're going to publish the final rules. We currently just have the proposed rules, which are like their first draft. And based on everything that they've been hearing and all the comments they got during the comment period, they're going to finalize those rules and give us a new set of rules. And the other rules that we have, so these are amendments to the existing rules under the Animal Welfare Act. For anyone who's interested in looking at it themselves, here it's 9 CFR subchapter 1, chapter 1, subchapter A, Animal Welfare. And these are all the existing regulations under the Animal Welfare Act for things like monkeys, guinea pigs, dogs, cats, etc. Some of this will apply, like the definition section that you will find here will apply to define some of the terms that are in the current the Animal Welfare Act regulations for birds. So if you guys want to do your own research after this, go look at the proposed regulation, but also go through these because these will also apply. So the general rule is that no person shall operate as a dealer, exhibitor, operator of an auction sale without a valid license. And you might read that and just think, well, I'm a breeder. None of this says breeder, so I don't count, right? Well, unfortunately, a dealer includes breeders. So basically, a dealer is anyone who, for compensation or profit, delivers, transports, delivers for transportation or transports or buys, sells, or negotiates the purchase of an animal. So what does that mean? It means if you sell an animal, even if you sell it at a loss, as long as you get $1 for the animal, you are a dealer. And exhibitor, on the other hand, is anyone who exhibits animals in acts such as zoos, educational exhibits, circuses, etc. This will also include free flyers, anyone who has like a rescue that lets people in to see the animals, who gives tours, anyone who has a collection of birds and gives a tour. All of these people might come under the regulation. So it is pretty expansive as to who it applies to. But there are exemptions. And the exemptions are a retail pet store, anyone who has less than 4 breeding females, anyone who sells less than $500 in gross income, and anyone who buys animals as pets and does not sell them. So let me explain what that means. A retail pet store, you might be thinking, well, I'm a breeder, I'm not a retail pet store. Well, the definition of a retail pet store is anyone who does face-to-face sales at a business or home. So if you're a breeder and you only sell your birds to people who come to your house and pick up the bird and pay you in person, then you're a retail pet store. Even though you're not a pet store, even it doesn't say Bob's Pets at your house. If you tell people come to my house, come to the house, or come to my neighbor's house, and I'll give you the bird and you give me the cash and we shake hands on it, you're a retail pet store. The 4 breeding females or less, that's an odd one because it's really, that rule's really for dogs. But in theory, if you only have 4 pairs, less than 4 pairs, you probably aren't regulated either. If you sell less than $500 gross income, and notice that that's gross, so that's not profit. That's, you know, if you sell $500 worth of birds, but it costs you $600 to breed them and sell them, you're still going to be regulated. And then obviously the last one is if you're just a pet owner. Now these exemptions, there's been a lot of debate with the USDA about it. So the value on the gross income one might change, as well as the one about 4 breeding females. The last conversation we had with them, it seemed like they were going to change those parts of the regulation because they realized they were going to get too many people. But we'll have to see what comes out on February 22nd. So what are you going to have to do? That's who's going to be licensed. Basically, breeders and exhibitors are going to need to be licensed. And what are you going to need if you're licensed? Well, you're going to need a vet. Of all the things that come out of this, the biggest and most important one is that you're going to need a vet, because you're going to need a vet who's like your facility vet, who's going to give you a veterinary care plan. And this veterinary care plan is needs to be relatively detailed. And honestly, it's to your benefit to have it more detailed than less. And so I'll explain that in a second, let's start with this. Your vet needs to come out periodically to view the facility. And they're going to want a physical inspection. So realistically, you're going to need a vet who you can work with, who can come out once a year to look at your birds, look at how you keep them, and be your facility vet. As part of that, what your vet's going to need to sign off on a form that they're going to produce that details certain things that they want done. Included in that is that your diet is adequate, that your cages are adequate, that your cage size is adequate, that, you know, if you have a bottle of antibiotic that you keep in the pantry, that they gave you that bottle of antibiotic and they gave you detailed instructions about when to use it and that to use it in consultation with them. Things like that. And for example, if you have a plucked bird, it's going to be to your benefit to have in the veterinary care plan, you know, a note that says cage 47, you know, the male is plucked. The bird is plucking for reasons not related to care. You know, the bird came plucked or whatever. That we've checked the bird and nothing indicates that the cage size or the lack of enrichment or the diet is causing the plucking, and so there's nothing to be done. Basically, your vet needs to, it's to your benefit to have your vet sign off on things like that. Or like if you have a bird that can't fly, you know, the vet should annotate cage 52, female can't fly, birth defect, or whatever it is. Just so when the inspectors come and they say, why is that bird plucked? You can point to your veterinary care plan and say, look, the vet looked at it. There's nothing to be done. It's just how the bird is. And that's going to be your protection against them giving you a hard time over things like that. So the next one, and I'm sure this is one a lot of people are concerned about, cages. So The primary rule is that your cages must be maintained to allow each bird to make normal posture and social adjustments. What does that mean? It basically means your bird needs to fit in the cage. I don't think anyone's gonna not meet this definition. But if you keep a macaw in a cage that the macaw can't open its wings to full open, your cage is probably too small and it might not meet this standard. But if you're a breeder who keeps them in, standard breeding size cages, you shouldn't have a problem. This is something that your vet will need to sign off on. Basically, it'll be to your benefit that because the rule doesn't give you a measurement size, someone needs to say that it meets that definition. And the easiest way to do that is just have your vet say the birds are in appropriate size cages. Write it on his review, and that's it. Now the cages need to be free of rust that affects structural integrity and sharp or jagged edges. So your cage can be rusty, but if it's so rusty that you touch it and it starts to fall apart, you have a problem. So, it's always lean. If this is a good opportunity to, change those old rusty cages if you got them. But in theory, as long as your cage is solid and it's just superficial rust, it's not a problem. And then sharp or jagged edges, nothing in the cage that if the bird flies around and hits itself, it's going to get stabbed with. That's basically the rule. And so the second part of this is that your cage has to be kept in good repair, protect them from injury, and restrict other animals from entry. Now, I've gone back and forth with the USDA about this one, and I know Steve has too. The restrict other animals from entering, it's pretty broad as it's written, but they keep telling me what they mean is that dangerous animals can't get in the cage, that a dog can't get in the cage, that a raccoon can't get in the cage. So this one's a little wishy-washy about what exactly it means. We're hoping to get some more guidance when the final rule comes out. But basically, your cages need to be built in a way that keeps the bird in, keeps other animals out, and doesn't hurt the animal, doesn't hurt the bird if it, flies around the cage and hits itself. So there's a regulation in there that says that you can't have battery cages. What that means is cages with adjoining walls. So if you have a row of cages and all the cages are built together and the wall that touches, so here's your cage and here's the dividing wall, and this wall is wire, this isn't allowed if the birds are biting each other through the wire. Now, the way it's written, I think it says you can't have battery cages, period. But again, going back and forth with the USDA, they say that it's one of those things that if your vet says there's no problem here, I don't see any reason why, I don't see the birds fighting, I don't see any problem, then the battery cage would be allowed. So again, this is another rule that's needs to be clarified a little bit, and hopefully we will get some clarification. But so if you're building new cages, I advise to err against having battery cages with common walls that are not solid. If you want to build a metal divider, that's fine. But if you have a wire divider, that might be a problem. If an inspector comes and says, "Oh, it looks like that bird's missing its toe. It looks like it stuck its finger through the wire and the other pair bit the toe off," you might have a problem. As to food and water, there's no rule about what you have to feed your birds. You just have to feed them food that's wholesome, palatable, free of contamination, and sufficient. And they must be fed at least once a day. So this basically means if you give pellets, you're fine. If you give seeds, you're fine. If you give sprouts and vegetables and greenery, you're fine. No one's saying you have to give pellets, or no one's saying you have to give sprouts, and no one's saying you have to give seeds. It's whatever you want. So long as the food is, palatable, the birds actually eat it, and free of contamination. So, make sure your pellets don't have rat droppings in them. But other than that, there's no rule about what you feed them. You do have to feed them at least once a day. So I know some bigger facilities feed 2 days worth of food and just check it on the second day and then feed on the third day. This rule kind of says you're not allowed to do that. Although I think if you give them 2 days worth of food and you check them to make sure they still have food, I think you're meeting the fed once a day rule. But again, if you're going to write up when you write up your veterinary care plan, just write in there the birds are fed once a day, and to make sure that you're covering that base. As to water, the general rule is that you must give them potable water, continually available in sufficient quantity. So you have to give your birds water. I don't think anybody here doesn't give their birds water, but that's the rule. You have to give them water. What that rule exactly means, again, I've gone back and forth with the USDA about it. We're hoping to get a little bit more clarification on what it actually means, because if you feed pellets and your birds like to dunk their pellets in the water, we all know that by the afternoon that water gets pretty nasty. So is that potable water? I don't know, because there's no definition of potable water. If your inspector comes at 4 p.m. and the water's dirty, is he going to say that water's not potable? I don't know. We're hoping to get more clarification on it. The video is from my breeding facility of the birds playing with their automatic water system. An automatic water system, as I read it, will basically cover your basis, and you have no reason, and will always meet the requirement. So again, if you're going to do any remodeling, any improvements to your facility before these rules come in effect, I would recommend an automatic water system, because then there's no question of you meeting the rule. So there's a rule about how to store your food and bedding. The general rule is that supplies of food, including food supplements, bedding, substrate, must be stored in a manner that protects the supplies from spoilage, contamination, and vermin. Basically, you need to keep your food from getting wet and full of rats. Now, that said, there's a couple silly things rolled into this that maybe will change, but probably won't. One is that your food and your bedding needs to be stored off the ground and away from the wall. So that's why I have a picture of a pallet, because basically you have to have on a pallet so you can sweep around it, sweep under it. If you have open bags of bedding and food, it needs to be in a sealed waterproof container. So like a rubber trash can with a lid. And that's bedding and food. So that's one thing that I've been going back and forth with the USDA, hoping they'll change, because I don't think it really makes sense that you need to keep your an open bag of shavings, for example, in a waterproof trash can. Yeah, I think it's good enough. I mean, if you have it in a room, that seems to be good enough to me. But that's, as of right now, the rule's written that everything that's open, food or bedding wise, needs to be in a sealed container. And then there's also a rule about like dish soap and cleaning products. As the rules is currently written, you can't keep your cleaning products in your food preparation area. So, for example, if you have a sink where you chop fruit and vegetables, in theory, as the rules currently written, you can't allow your soap on the table. I think that one's going to change. I'm hoping that one will change, but there are going to be some rules that probably prohibit for you. So for example, I have a shed. Half of my shed is where my food is stored. On the other half, I have my leaf blower, my rat poison, and a couple other things that I keep. They're separate, but they're in the same room. That may be prohibited. It's unclear. We're hoping to get some more guidance on it, but it seems like the regulations as currently written are going to require you to keep food and bedding in one room, and then another room for gasoline, equipment, poisons away from the food. So if you have that all in one room, you may have to break that up into 2 rooms apart from each other to meet the rule. Well, although that's something, again, I'm hoping we get some more clarification on the final rule, but it is something that might be required. And this is a big one. The new regulations are going to require you to identify your birds. So this basically means every bird is going to need either a leg band or a microchip. At your breeding center, you can either have the birds microchipped, leg banded, or you can put a little placard on the cage that says "Tu Perura Molinae, male and female," and that'll be good enough for your breeding center. But all the birds that go out are going to need a leg band, and you can avoid putting the little sign on your cage if you leg band all your birds or microchip all your birds. So personally, I leg banded all my birds, and everything going forward is going to be leg banded. If you prefer microchipping, that's fine. You can microchip your birds. You just have to have the reader available for the inspector if he comes to visit and he wants to check that your birds are microchipped. You might have to pull one out and scan it so he can see that you're not lying to him. But my advice is put open leg bands on all your unbanded birds, because if the birds in the cage are leg banded, that's good enough. And band all your birds starting next year. Why do they want you to identify your birds? Well, the regulations are going to require that you keep records of all births, deaths, sales, transfers, etc. So you're going to need a logbook that says, cage 27, 4 chicks, legs band 1 through 4. Leg band 1 was sold to, Mr. Smith. Leg band 2 was sold to Mr. Bill, etc., etc. If you're selling to other people with USDA licenses, you're going to have to take down their USDA license and their identifying information. If you're selling to someone who doesn't have a USDA license, you're going to have to take down their driver's license information and the tag of their car. Shipping. I know this is one that people were concerned about. This rule is written in the negative, but really what it's saying is you can ship unweaned birds so long as it's in your veterinary care plan. So basically, you're gonna have to tell your vet, hey, I want to ship unweaned birds. And he's gonna say, okay, how are you gonna do it? And you're gonna say, well, I'm gonna ship them no younger than 6 weeks. I'll make sure that they're fed right before they go on the flight, direct flights or no journey is gonna be longer than 12 hours. And I'm gonna put on the cage that they have to be fed as soon as they're picked up. Basically what you already do with Delta is going into the regulations. So you will be able to ship unweaned birds. You just have to have a little protocol written into your veterinary care plan that says this is how we're going to do it. You're also going to need to develop an enrichment plan with your vet. Now, that enrichment plan needs to talk about social group enrichment, environmental enrichment, and special considerations. That sounds like a lot, but really the rule says examples of environmental enrichment include perches, swings, mirrors, providing objects to manipulate, varying food items, foraging tasks, providing interaction with your caregiver, etc. So what does that mean? You're gonna need to write up an enrichment plan, but the enrichment plan is gonna be, once a week, I give them fresh vegetables. They have wooden perches that get switched out every 6 months. And when I walk by the cages, I say, hey, pretty bird, that's enrichment. It's not, it's a little bit more, it's things we probably all do. Everyone changes the food every once in a while. That's enrichment. Everyone talks to the birds. That's enrichment. We all switch out perches periodically. That's enrichment. If you give them fresh vegetables every once in a while or fresh fruit, that's enrichment. I give my birds corks every once in a while. That's enrichment. It's nothing over the top. You don't have to go to Petco and buy $1,000 worth of toys for your birds. Just give them a natural wood perch every once in a while, give them some vegetables, give them a toy, give them something to chew on, talk to them, and you'll meet and write down that that's what you do, and that's your enrichment plan. Housekeeping. The regulations are going to require that you keep your facility clean, in good repair, free of trash, weeds, and uncontrolled brush. This one's just a relatively simple one. I end on it because I think it's something easy for everyone to do. If you have a piece of, we all have that corner of the yard where we throw the junk. Now's a good time to get started on your USDA, on compliance with USDA regulations. Pick up the junk and throw it out. they're not, this one's obviously not gonna be something very strict, but you know, if you have a lot of clutter, if you have a lot of crap, if you have a lot of trash, they might say something, so, you know, take a look around your place, figure out what you don't need, trash it, and it's a good start to getting in compliance with the USDA regulations. Anyway, that was the quick version of this speech. Here's my contact info if you guys want to take it down, if you want to speak to me directly in the future. But I think now we'll go into the Q&A. I think, Steve, we can answer the ones that people sent in before, and then we can open the floor to everybody else. Does that work for you?
Great. Good job, David. Thank you.
Yeah. I didn't want to go on too long, so I hope I didn't go too fast at the same time.
Well, probably good you cut me off then.
So let me pull up these questions.
So we have one in the Zoom chat.
Okay,
Asking
let's
you,
go with that.
David, specifically, does the regulation address whether or not health certificates are required for shipping?
No, I don't believe there's any requirement to health certificates. Let me. No, there's no requirement for that beyond. No, there's no requirement for that beyond what the airline might already require, but beyond that, there's no requirement for health certificates. There's one in here as well as do my chickens need to be NPIP certified and avian influenza free to have them near bird parameters, or you can't have poultry at all? So obviously there's been a lot of stuff going on about avian influenza, but the USDA regulations don't, the Animal Welfare Act regulations don't have anything to do with influenza, or any requirements about having chickens near your animals. Now, if you have your chickens near your parrots and they're causing a welfare concern, they're making the birds sick, then yes, that probably would trigger something under the regulation. But there's nothing that per se says you can't have chickens or that they have to have, avian influenza shots or anything like that. That's really up to you. And, if you're shipping birds or exporting birds and there's a risk that they have avian influenza, that's a whole different problem, but it's not under the Animal Welfare Act regulations. Okay, there's quite a few questions in here. So Heather asks, are all the birds on the premise going to be regulated? So birds like peacocks, swans, wood ducks, emus. So the USDA has said they're going to be regulating pet birds, and that in their final rule, they're probably going to come out with a better definition of pet birds. But currently, pet birds means anything like a parrot, a canary, a finch, probably peacocks, swans, wood ducks, emus. They're probably not going to want to regulate those because they're not going to consider them pet birds. And the definition of pet bird is any bird that's commonly kept in U.S. households. So while there's a lot of people who have swans and peacocks and wood ducks and emus, I don't think it's commonly kept in U.S. households. But we have to see on the final rule what they're going to define as pet birds.
I'll add a little bit to that,
Yeah.
if I could, David. In the proposed draft, it appears that things like game bird and waterfowl are exempt as agricultural products, essentially. So yes, the USDA does want to go after pet birds, but that doesn't mean they are going to ignore things like hornbills and kookaburras and turacos that are not typically pet birds. USDA has told me directly that they are looking to regulate those. What they are exempting is birds that are raised for agricultural purposes, which they're including game birds, pheasants, ducks, things like that, which are, they fit more for an agricultural purpose than they do for a household pet sort of thing.
Okay, yeah, no, I when I spoke to them, Steve, I got a different feeling, but we have to ultimately see what they're gonna say, because they were telling me that they were gonna base it off what commonly comes into vet offices. So, you know, I don't think people are taking, there's gonna be a lot of records of people taking their hornbill to the vet, but enough for them to consider it a pet bird, but we have to see what they ultimately decide on that point. But Steve is right. Things that fall into more of the game bird categories, including most waterfowl, are probably not going to be regulated. All right, this is what I've seen a bunch of times. So will the Animal Welfare Act address the rescues who are making money from adopting birds out as well? We continue to see exceptions for them for a lot of regulations. So the rescue question is interesting and a little bit complicated. So yes, if they're adopting for a fee, that brings them under the dealer definition of the Animal Welfare Act. So that'll make them a dealer, just like a breeder is a dealer, just like a wholesaler is a dealer. As much as they'll probably kick and scream about it, they're gonna be dealers, and so they will be regulated on that via that definition. But as we were talking at the beginning, the retail pet store exemption means a face-to-face transaction. So, you know, there's not a lot of rescues that I know that ship their birds to people. So, you know, if they require you to come to the rescue to pick up the bird and pay the donation fee in person, then yes, they're gonna get themselves exempted under that exemption. Now, does that mean if you know a rescue that's doing bad things that you shouldn't call the USDA on them? You probably should, because then they're gonna have to justify themselves to the USDA, and you never know what exactly these rescues are doing. But a rescue, the taking the money brings them under the dealer provision, but the fact that most of them require you to come pick the bird up at the place means that they're probably going to fall into the retail pet exemption. Let me see. So does the regulation address minimum temperature standards like dogs and cats have? So the regulations go into quite a bit of detail about this, about temperature and acclimatizing the birds before you change the weather and stuff like that. If you're breeding outdoors, you know, we have parrot species. If you're breeding them outdoors outside of Southern Texas, Southern California, or Florida, you're probably going to need to show that you have some sort of protocol to bring them in when it's cold out. But you know, as long as your inspector doesn't come and there's snow on the ground and the bird's in a bear cage with no shelter, you should be okay. But there's no set, you know, below 40 degrees, the bird needs to come indoors. There's no set temperature definition. The birds just need to be safe, essentially.
I'll add a little bit to that if I could. There's a basic principle of these regulations that's important to understand. There are two types of husbandry regulations. There's one that's called engineering standards and one that's called performance standards. And very basically, the difference between those two is engineering standards are those standards that specify an exact temperature or cage size, something of that nature, whereas performance standards have language like the cage or the temperature has to be appropriate for the health and welfare of the bird. It's very general language. So in a concern about a minimum temperature that your birds can survive or are acclimated to, my personal advice would be to put that as part of your veterinary protocol. So you're going to have your attending veterinarian who's going to approve your written set of husbandry protocols that you have on your facility. And if you put that in there, that my birds are acclimated to winter temperatures for the local environment, you can even specify it gets down to negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever you experience. And if your birds are acclimated to that and your veterinarian approves that, then when the USDA inspector comes by and starts to give you a hassle because it's cold outside, you point to the fact that you have that in your veterinarian approved protocols, and that's what protects you against that sort of, it's not really a violation at that point because you're in compliance with your veterinary approved protocols.
Yeah. And just to clarify something, Steve, so when you say performance standards, so people don't misunderstand this, performance doesn't mean, oh, here's my breeding log and I bred 100 birds last year. Look what great performance I have. No, performance means the performance of the welfare of the animal. So it's a little bit of a misleading word, but basically it's not showing, oh, I bred these many birds. It's basically saying I have the birds out here, and even though it's 30 degrees out, they're not dropping dead and they're happy. That's the performance.
Exactly. As long as you're meeting the welfare and health needs of the bird, that is the performance standard that you're meeting.
Yeah. Steve, so this one might be one that you're more knowledgeable about than I am as well. Was there any mention, this is Nancy Dalton, was there any mention of shows or marts? I understand that we may be subject to inspection on an individual level, but what if we hold a mart at a central location with multiple vendors participating?
Yeah, there's language in there, or at least there used to be. I'd have to check to see if it's still there. But something called trade day sales were typically exempt. So a bird mart itself is exempt, but the vendors there, of course, have to be licensed if they're wholesaling birds or any other covered activity. Also exempt are actual bird shows like the National Bird Show. So if you exhibit birds at the National Bird Show or the bird show itself, they don't have to be licensed and inspected by USDA. But as we know, most people that go to the National Bird Show are typically breeders or people who raise and sell birds at some point, away from the bird show throughout the year. So they might be required to be licensed depending on if they meet the other requirements. But the bird show itself doesn't need to be licensed. Now, it gets into a little bit of difficulty because we have educational events where you might have a parrot expo where people come and show their birds as an educational event where you charge admission to come in. And according to the language, those would need to be licensed as an exhibitor. So there's a little bit of kind of slop between those two. And like a lot of this stuff, we have to essentially wait and see how USDA is going to treat these. And that, of course, leads to a lot of uncertainty, right? So we don't know where that line is going to be drawn until USDA starts drawing it. And without clear language, David and I have talked to USDA about this, without clear language in the regulations, we're concerned that the regulations will be pushed in a direction that is unfavorable to us. So, it's a double-edged sword having specific language in there, but that specific language can also protect us. It's a matter of wisely written language to do that though. And that's part of what we're arguing with the USDA about at this point.
Yeah. And I mean, Steve, I think that you're 100% correct. The bird mart itself won't need to be licensed, but the vendors probably will. And for example, if you're selling at the bird mart, that's not your residence or business. So you're already selling, you're not under the retail pet exemption. So I think just the act of selling at the bird mart, the individual who's doing the sale will probably need a USDA license. Because there's nothing in there about an exemption for selling at the bird mart. So the bird mart itself, as the institution, doesn't need the license, but the vendors probably will.
Right.
Yeah. So Heather's asking, what will happen to people who breed out of their homes, like people up north who are just starting and don't have money for a huge facility? Are the USDA reps going to be okay with birds being in someone's living room or a side room in a residential home? So this one's a tricky one as well, because the USDA has basically said, they don't really want to come into your home. But yes, if you're breeding out of your home, if you have a bird room, if you have a house and you have a bird room and you breed out of your bird room, they're gonna come in your house to look. And there's nothing in the regulations that say, you have to breed out of a breeding facility. You can breed out of your home. They'll be fine with that. And I mean, dog people are regulated, and dog people breed out of their homes mostly. So the USDA is okay with that. But it is basically, having the USDA tromp through your house and look at your birds. And there's no exemption for mom and pop breeders. So you have to meet the same regulations that everyone else meets. But yeah, they're going to be fine with it being in your home as long as it's up to the standards that they expect it to be.
Yeah, I'll add on a little bit, and this sort of addresses Jacob's question also about the timing of enforcement. Technically, when they publish the final rule, it is enforced at that point, but USDA has told us that they expect a ramp-up period, probably 6 months or so, to allow for people to apply for licenses, go through the licensing process, et cetera, et cetera. It's likely that USDA is going to be targeting larger facilities first and then working their way down. So how far down they go, we don't know yet. And what the final de minimis exemptions are, we also don't know yet. They've hinted that they may be different than what currently exists. So we have to wait till they publish the final rule to find out what that is. But USDA has expressed their intent to start with larger facilities, definitely commercial facilities first, before they start getting down into some of the smaller facilities. Jacob also asked about shipping birds through USPS and whether that will be compliant or not. I don't know of anything specifically, David, you can correct me if I'm wrong, about USPS not meeting the requirements. The requirements for shipping birds are, the language is in the regulation. So if you can do that within USPS, I don't see why it would be automatically, illegal to ship that way. I think a lot of USPS shipping, because the Postal Service doesn't allow any citizens, for example, to be shipped. But a lot of what is shipped through USPS is going to be game bird, day-old chicks and things like that are exempt anyways. So I'm not going to ask you what you're shipping in USPS, but I don't see a reason for it to automatically be disqualified or against the regulations.
Yeah, so the regulations have a bunch of provisions about how shippers have to handle it. but that's on the shipper end. So it's not, those don't apply to you, it's not something you have to do. It's something that the company, Delta, USPS, whatever shipping the live animal, the live bird has to comply with. I don't think there's any reason that USPS won't be able to handle those regulations. So I don't think it's gonna ban shipments on USPS. And I don't see any reason why, the common thing I've gotten in through USPS is a dove, an adult dove. There's no reason there's nothing I've seen that would, in the regulations, that would say you wouldn't be able to ship a dove through the mail without meeting the requirement. And to the other point, Jacob, I don't know, Steve, yet if there's usually there's an effective date from when the regulation is published. So the regulation will get published February 22nd, 2023. It's minimum 90 days. Sometimes they give 180 days. That's required by the APA to allow for pre-enforcement litigation. So it'll probably be at least 90 days before the effective date comes in. And then when I spoke to Dr. Yeager at the ASA event, there is going to be a grace period of probably at least a year, is how I understood it, where they're going to basically be like, getting it out there and telling people they have to register. And, it's not going to be a problem, at least within that year. And that's sending in your application. And once you send in your application, you can keep doing what you're doing until they come around and see you. And who knows how long it'll take for them to actually come around and see you. If you're a smaller facility, it'll probably take them quite a while for them to come around and see you. So it's going to be a rolling launch, I think, on these regulations, and it'll probably roll for quite a bit of time until they really get it going. And like you said, let's see where they stop, where they care. Rob, what's the cost of a license? I forget what it is, but it's not expensive. It's like $100 or less to get the license. There was a question here about rescues that I wanted to go back to the rescue issue. I can't remember what the question was, but here there are hundreds of home rescues where the birds are kept in the home, and a lot of foster-based rescues where they're required to be licensed. So I wanted to go back to the rescue point because I did say that they'll probably hit the retail pet exemption, but the exhibitor rule is where, for the people who are interested in messing with the rescues, to say it one way, the exhibitor rule is probably where you'll get the rescues, because the exhibitor rule says you can't exhibit an animal for any type of money without being licensed. So for example, this is an example I used a couple times already, but like if you have a macaw that you free fly, and you go to a school or a park or an event and you free fly the birds, and you say, I'm doing it for fun, I like people seeing the birds, just give me gas money. And they give you $50 because that's what your gas was to get to the place. By taking those $50, you're an exhibitor that needs a license. So if the rescues post pictures, here's this plucked macaw I just got, please donate $1,000 for me to take it to the vet, that makes them an exhibitor looking for money. And so that will bring them under the regulations. And I've spoken to the USDA about this. Social media is an exhibiting to the public. So if you post it on Instagram, if you post it on Facebook, any of these rescues that have a Facebook page, an Instagram, a YouTube channel, go on Reddit, whatever, they post a picture and say, look at this poor baby, I need money to do all the things that will make them an exhibitor that needs a license. So being an exhibitor doesn't give them the full suite of requirements that would give us a breeder, but it does make them get a license, and they're going to need a vet plan and inspections and all that stuff. So that's the way you get the rescues regulated, is through documenting, look, they're posting on Facebook and saying, I need $100 to take this bird to the vet.
And the key word there is the money part, actually. So, because we had a number of people asking, for example, about sharing pictures of their birds on Facebook. Is that going to make them an exhibitor? Well, if you're just posting pictures of your birds and sharing it on social media, that's fine. You're not making money on that. But where it does become problematic are for those people who have, for example, a YouTube channel, and they're posting their birds and they're getting funding from YouTube. You're an exhibitor. You're making money off of doing that. So you'll need to be licensed according to the regulations as they're written. And those are things that we'll have to address as this moves forward. If we need to push USDA for specific exemptions for certain activities, there's a way to do that. That might be something we can do in the future. At this point, though, I don't think there's going to be any exemptions for that.
Yeah, and exactly. If you're monetized on social media through showing your birds, you're gonna need a license. So okay, going back to the shipping, someone's saying, do you expect the airlines that do still ship to eventually require proof of licensure from the shippers, so as to be sure they're not complicit with the illegal activity? Yeah, probably. I wouldn't be surprised if the airlines did such a thing. But you got to understand, if you're shipping a bird, you already have to another USDA licensed person, you already have to take down their license information or their drivers. You already have to document all of this. So really, if the airline requires you to show your license, you know, it's not a big deal, because you're already having to share your license with the person who's buying it. So you know, I don't know if I'm not sure if the airlines are explicitly required to take it down, but I wouldn't be surprised, and I don't think it's a big deal. Heather also asked, what are the consequences if you forgot to write down in your logbook that you produced, or a bird got out, or you need to find or lose your license? So realistically, the odds that they're going to go through your logbook and realize, oh, you didn't write down when bird number 345 was born, it's not likely. But yes, if you miss something, you know, it's one of those things where they might give you it's not a citation, it's not a fine, but basically saying, oh, you know, here's a demerit.
It's a correction notice.
An infraction, yeah. And you know, you need to correct it and make sure it doesn't happen again. And if it keeps happening, you know, it could create a problem where you lose your license or you have to go in front of their administrative court. But like, realistically, if you keep a decent logbook and you occasionally forget to log a bird, it's not, you know, I don't think anyone's gonna ever catch you, you know. But, and again, it doesn't have to be a fancy Excel sheet or anything like that. You can literally keep a paper logbook, handwritten in your chicken scratch, and as long as, you know, you have it and say, look, here it is, you know, it'll be good enough. You know, if someday something happens and they go through it in detail and they check all your sales and they call everyone up and they investigate you for whatever reason, you know, it might be a problem if you missed one. But like, you know, it's not likely. Alex is asking if we can go over the retail pet exemption one more time. And yeah, I'll do that because it's counterintuitive. It's poorly named. It's called the retail pet exemption, but what it means is, imagine, so you're a breeder, you have a bird, you know, and let's say you're a little breeder, you got 10 cages in your backyard, and you want to sell your sun conure. As long as you say to the person who wants to buy it, you need to come to my house and we're both going to stand on the porch and I'm going to give you the carrier with the bird in it, and you're going to give me the $500 and hand it to me in my hand, and then we're going to shake hands and everyone's going to go their own way. That's a retail pet exemption. Now, if you say, if you list your sun conure on Birds Now, and you're in Florida and someone in Minnesota wants your sun conure, and you have to take it to Delta Cargo and put it on the plane and ship it to them, and they sell you the money, you're no longer a retail pet exemption. It's very limited to a face-to-face sale that is not wholesale. So that's the two requirements. It has to be face-to-face and it has to not be wholesale. I hope that clears it up. I know it's counterintuitive, but basically you have to imagine that your house is a pet store. And as long as someone, walks into your house and you ring it up on the machine and say, here's your bird, thank you for the money, goodbye. Like that's a retail, you're basically a retail pet store. So someone's asking, Jacob's asking, how can they get away with forcing the regulations on finches and canaries when animals like fish and reptile are not? So that was Congress's decision. Congress, in their infinite wisdom, decided to regulate birds and not fish and reptiles.
Well, very plainly, the Animal Welfare Act applies to all warm-blooded animals. So snakes and fish are not warm-blooded.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that they can't at some point expand the definition of animal to include ectothermic or cold-blooded animals. But at this point, there isn't one. That's basically how birds got dragged into this, because the original language said all warm-blooded animals. Then USDA started excluding them, and they excluded birds and they excluded rats and mice. So for many years, that's how it was. That's why birds were exempted, was simply because USDA said, yeah, we're not going to do birds. And that's why they got sued originally in 1999, and then again in 2019. And that's what put us here.
Yeah.
So their decision to exempt birds was found to be in violation of the language of the Animal Welfare Act. So that language is warm-blooded animals.
Yeah, for pet purposes, because the Animal Welfare Act does explicitly exempt poultry and animals used for non-pet purposes. So
yeah, well, I would be careful about the pet purposes, because really the exemption is for research laboratories, because they're already regulated, or for rats and mice bred for research, or the retail exemption, and agricultural purposes is the other one. And that's why things like exotics. So what helps to understand how this is structured is to really look at mammals. So originally, dogs, cats, rabbits, guinea pigs, hamsters, that's what was regulated for many years. And I think it was around 1970s or so, could have been the 80s, I don't remember off the top of my head, but that's when all exotic mammals came under the Animal Welfare Act. So the Animal Welfare Act since that point has covered everything from elephants to shrews. And that's mostly what you see in a zoo, right? All these exotic animals. But any private facility that raises, for example, sugar gliders or hedgehogs, they have to be licensed under these requirements as well. So for birds, it's going to follow essentially that type of regulation that they already have in place for what you could basically call exotic mammals. So that covers kind of everything. Then the Animal Welfare Act has specific requirements for dogs, for cats, for hamsters. They have specific requirements for non-human primates, right? Monkeys and apes. They have specific requirements for marine mammals, right? So there are some things that have specific requirements for mammals, but everything else that doesn't fit in one of those categories is lumped together in one set of regulations. And that's essentially what USDA is using to model the bird regulations.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a question from Denise and a question for Wayne that I think work together well. So let's do them together. How does this affect small hobbyist breeders? I only sell to my local bird shop in small numbers. Will I still be able to do this? And Wayne asks, what if you sell chicks to a local retailer and they prefer them at the age before they could be banded? So Denise, as it's currently written, unless you're selling less than $500, you will need to be licensed. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you're basically saying you're not on the retail pet exemption because you're taking them to the pet store, and there's no definition of wholesale, but the USDA will probably argue that that's a wholesale sale because you're selling them to the pet shop who then resells them. I mean, legalistically, as a lawyer, there's an argument to be made that they might not meet the wholesale definition of wholesale, but the USDA probably would argue that it is wholesale. So yes, in theory, if you're a mom and pop who has 5 or 10 pairs and you just breed enough to pay your feed bill and your toy bill and your whatever bill, it sounds ridiculous, but just because you're covering costs, so your hobby doesn't put you in the negative, that'll bring you under the regulation unless you're selling face to face, not wholesale. Wayne, you need to ban your birds. There's no way around it. I mean, even if they're even though the pet store wants them at 3 weeks, and the ban doesn't stay on, the regulation is going to require you to ban them because every bird has to be individually marked, and the rule doesn't allow for you to tattoo them sequentially. So
yeah, I don't see. I interpret it a little differently than David does on that. And I've talked to USDA about that issue specifically because there are birds that we can't ban, and there are birds that we can't microchip. And what USDA has told me is that any identification is fine. And that includes simply a card on the enclosure. So the bird can be completely unmarked. So if you're selling, 3 baby conures at 3 or 4 weeks of age to your local pet store, and you're not able to band them yet, as long as you identify them that, bird 1, 2, and 3 in there, and maybe give a description of their marking so you can identify them individually, that paper identification that accompanies them does meet the requirements as far as I understand it.
Yeah, I mean, and this might be a place where we disagree, and maybe a point where we need some final guidance on the USDA. I agree with you that once they're in the cage, if you want to take if you sell breeder to breeder and it comes with a breeder leg band, and you want to take it off, you can take it off and you can put it in the cage, and you just got to include the little placard that says, species name, male has white fleck on the eye, female doesn't, or Tuperura Molinae, they look the same. Like that little placard would be enough. But there is a requirement that they all have to be individually identified when in commerce. So maybe there's a way, maybe they'll say it's good enough to just say, 3 sun conures, one has one white toenail on the left, one has white toenail on the right, middle one has no white toenails, and that might be good enough. But I don't think so, because it defeats the whole purpose of identifying, which is being able to track the bird from breeder to wholesaler to pet store to final consumer. So I'm assuming they're going to require leg bands. Wayne, my opinion, my lawyerly opinion, is err on the side of caution and just wait an extra week and put the leg band on. That, to me, that's the safest way of doing this. You'll never have any problem if you leg band everything. That's my legal opinion, my personal / legal opinion. Take it as you want, and we'll see what the USDA says at the end of the day. Hopefully they will publish something clear on this. That's because it is a little weird to say you need identifying marks, but then also say you can give it with a little placard. It's not like, I don't know. It doesn't make much sense to me when 99% of the birds look identical. So Candy is asking, I use my personal parrots for teaching vet techs. How do I handle a parrot for exams, grooming, etc.? do you know well, she's asking, does she need an exhibitor license? Steve, do you know the answer to this? I think there's an exemption for vets.
Yeah, I don't know specifically. My feeling is, for what it's worth, is that would not require a license. Where you're getting into the gray areas because you're teaching, so you're teaching, I'm assuming you're getting paid to teach. I teach in the vet tech program too. I get paid for it, and I do bring my birds in as well. So the fact that I get paid to teach and I use birds basically to instruct how to handle, etc. I think that if you were to take a strict interpretation of the language, that would apply. But I honestly don't think that's where USDA is going with this. I know that's, worth maybe a half a cup of coffee or something, what the intent of the USDA is. But honestly, Cindy, I wouldn't worry about it until you're forced to do something about it. If somebody requires you to get a license, then yeah, you'll have to make the decision whether you continue to use your birds for that or not. But again, it sort of comes down to the intent of the Animal Welfare Act. And the intent is to create minimum standards of care to make sure these animals are cared for properly, et cetera. And I don't see how what you're doing with your birds in the classroom would be somehow interpreted otherwise. Basically, you are helping improve standards of care by using your birds to teach your vet techs. So I don't think the USDA would interpret it that way. But like I said, according to the language.
Candy, feel free to email me about this or call me if you like, because I'll go through the regulations and look at it for you. Because I'm pretty sure there's an exemption for vet care things. So I think you might fall into some sort of vet exemption, but I would have, just to be clear, just to be sure, I would want to go through the regulation and look at it for you. But this does feel like something that would fall into a vet exemption, because vets aren't regulated, as part of their, program of veterinary program. So that sounds to me like it would fall into something that would be exempt, but I would want to look it up for you just to be sure. So Debbie Goodrich asks, how do we deal with having a show one time a year as far as a display? Does the show need to have a license? The birds are not our birds so much as the collection of various people's birds that attend. So I'm guessing this is again about a bird show, which bird shows are exempt from the licensing requirement.
Well,
now,
I think what Debbie's asking about is slightly different. She's not talking about a bird mart. She puts on an educational event. So people come to this, it's like a fair for birds, but they're not selling birds there, but they are doing educational programs. And I think where that runs into problems is if you charge admission for that event, then you are becoming an exhibitor of birds under the Animal Welfare Act. But your case is one that sort of falls in between, and we'd really have to see how USDA ends up enforcing that, whether they enforce it or not. So unfortunately, there isn't a clear answer for you.
Yeah. So I'm not promoting this, but someone texted me a question directly, and I'm going to answer it. Ryan Eatman's asking, what will happen to people who travel to bird fairs and sell their birds in other states? Ryan, that's no different than any of this. It's not a retail pet exemption. You're a breeder. You're selling a bird in another state. You're traveling with the bird. You fall into the dealer. You become a dealer. You're a dealer, and you have to be licensed. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you do it in your state or out of your state. But if you're not selling out of your home, if you're not selling out of your home and not wholesaling, you are a dealer. Okay, so how often would the USDA come out, since the vets will have to come out once a year and the USDA license is good for 3 years? So theoretically, they're going to come out yearly to do an inspection, an unannounced inspection once a year. At the ASA event, I met the Florida inspector, not the Florida inspector, the Miami inspector, the one who's going to be my personal inspector. And he told me that he already inspects 100 to 150 facilities without birds, you know, all the other facilities that he has to inspect. So, you know, at a minimum, Miami's going to add another 50 to 100 inspections a year onto his docket just for birds. So is he really going to come out once a year? I doubt it because he's basically going to have to be inspecting every day of the year. You know, every working day of the year, if that's, you know, if he has 200 to 250 places to inspect a year. So realistically, if you're, it's probably going to depend where you are and how busy the USDA inspector is, but you should see him theoretically once a year, probably not. The license is good for 3 years. And in theory, you're supposed to see them yearly in that 3-year period. Although I've heard stories of people who have never seen their USDA inspector. So it's one of those things. It's going to be a roll of the dice to how often you actually see them.
Yeah, and that gets a little confusing too, because that's the USDA inspection, but the USDA also wants to see your attending veterinarian, you know, check out your facility as well. And the whole challenge of getting an attending veterinarian who can come out to your facility to approve your veterinary plan of care, that's a whole nother challenge on top of all this. And that's something we're really struggling with right now. You know, the vets are packed as it is. There's not many vets that are going to be making house calls for bird licensing. So that's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah, and I mean, one of those things is, you know, it's going to be setting up a relationship with your vet, but also don't put the burden on your vet to write your veterinary care plan. So they're going to give you a form that that's going to be a basis for it. But basically, you know, you fill out the form for your vet, you attach your amendment, and basically, you know, write everything you want. You know, cage 47 plucked, cage 52 can't fly. You know, my birds are acclimated, just like Steve said. All those things, write it all up, and then when your vet comes, say like, "Hey, I wrote this for you. Scheme it if you'd like. Sign at the end." And you know, because no vet's going to want to do that for you. You know, you're going to have to do that work for. You're going to have to do that work for them. And you know, if they're hesitant about signing it, you know, explain to them why you need it. But this really is going to be something you need to develop a relationship with your vet. And no one's asked it yet, so I'm just going to preempt it though. It doesn't have to be an avian vet. It doesn't have to be any sort of specialized vet. It just needs to be a vet. They just need to have a license. You know, it has to be a licensed vet. Who licensed them? Whoever licenses vet. I don't know who does it, but it just needs. They need to have a valid vet license. And you know, if they tell you, "Oh, gee whiz, I don't know, you know, a canary from a macaw," you know, tell them doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It's just a checker. It's just these are lots of boxes to check. You know, I mean, I don't think anyone here wants to mistreat their birds. I think we all believe that the welfare of the birds is important. But at the end of the day, these are just boxes to check. And you just need to check them off so that nobody gives you a hard time. So Fran Anderson is asking, will forms be coming out, which will lay out how we need to do the records? Also, any idea of availability of record appropriate bird software? I don't know about any bird software. I'm not sure if they're going to give you a form if the USDA doesn't put out a form for the record keeping. I've had this thought with that the OPA would do it, Steve. Maybe OPA and ASA can work on it together. We can develop a form that we can give out to our members that basically say, fill this out every time you sell a bird or something like that. And it's really not that complicated. The most complicated part is going to be when you sell. Any log book that anybody keeps, pair 1, 3 chicks, these are the leg bands, that'll be good enough for your internal record keeping. It's really only going to be when you sell that you have to do a couple things like take down their name, take down their address, take down their USDA license. If they don't have a USDA license, you have to take down their driver's license and the tag on their car if they came in a car. So, that one's a little more complicated, and we'll try to, if USDA doesn't give us a form to fill out, we'll produce one for you guys.
Yeah, my understanding is the USDA website has, kind of a guideline for applying for licenses now if you're a mammal facility. And my understanding is that they'll be updating that specifically for birds. So there'll be a resource there that will spell out, exactly what you need to do and the process you'll need to go through. But I do think it's a good idea for OPA and ASA and all the other bird organizations to go ahead and, boil that down, make it as easy as possible. That's one of the services we should provide to our community.
John Ains just texted me saying that the USDA does have a form. They have a lot of forms. Unfortunately, I haven't gone through all of them, but apparently they do have a form for record keeping. And he also recommends zooeasy.com as a record keeping software. So, that's John. John usually has good advice. And I believe John is already USDA licensed for some of his other animals. If you breed birds and sell them at your place, but you also wholesale some birds, would you still be required to have a USDA license? Yes. This is kind of the tricky thing in that, yes, if you do one thing that triggers the licensing requirement, you have to be licensed. It's not like, oh, the birds on the left I only breed for retailing, for my retail pet exemption, but the birds on the left I wholesale. No, if you breed, if you wholesale one, wholesale one clutch, but you sell everything retail pet exemption, you're still going to need to be licensed. Yeah. So is it only that my vet would have to inspect my facility if I get licensed, or does the USDA inspect as well? I'm greatly concerned about possible disease transmission. So this is from Denise Alpert. Denise, if you have a protocol for preventing disease, they have to follow it. So, but if that's something you're concerned about, you have to have your protocol written down. They have to do an F10 shoe bath, and then they have to put on, a lab coat or whatever it is that you want them to do. They will follow it. So if you have disease concerns, that's fine, but you have to make sure that you have a protocol and then ask them to follow it when they get there. As to the inspections, so the USDA inspects in that they come and they look around. Your vet isn't inspecting. Your vet is coming and doing a vet visit. They got to walk down the aisle, look at the birds, talk to you. If you've ever taken a vet a bird to the vet, they ask you the questions and they go over the bird or whatever. It's sort of like that. Your vet just needs to come out and look around. It's too different. It's not really an inspection. The USDA is inspecting, and they'll look at your birds. But if they say, why is this bird sick? They want to see your vet plan. I don't know if I'm making sense here.
Yeah, they're two different inspections, exactly.
Yeah.
The USDA inspection is making sure you're in compliance with the language of the Animal Welfare Act. That's the regulations. Part of those regulations require you to have an attending veterinarian. So they want a veterinarian to come out and review your husbandry and to sign off on your written plan. And the USDA is basically looking for that to happen on a regular basis, roughly annually. There's nothing in the language that specifies how often your attending veterinarian needs to visit your facility, but USDA has said they're essentially looking for an annual visit by your attending veterinarian. The inspection from the USDA is separate from that. They're looking at everything else in addition to that. Just quickly, for example, one of the things they look for is expiration dates on your cleaning supplies, on your feed. If you have anything that is beyond the expiration date, that's basically a violation. You're not going to get fined for that. You get a notice of correction, which means you got to get that out of there and replace it with whatever cleaning supplies haven't been expired yet. So they'll give you a month or two and come back out to make sure you've corrected that. That's how that works. So that's the USDA inspection. It's different than your own personal veterinarian.
Yeah. And on that point, yes, I didn't bring this up when I was talking about the food. They are not going to allow you to feed food past an expiration date. So, if you're one of those people who gets discount food because it's past the date stamped on the bag, you're not allowed to do that. Obviously, they're not. I mean, this is just FYI, but obviously, if you take it out of the bags and you put it in your bins, they'll never know. But if they look at the bag and it has a stamped date on it, it's a problem. Stanley asked, can you record your inspector's visits? Yes, I mean, they're going to be on your property. There's no regulation that they could write that would prevent you from doing that. So feel free to record.
It specifically says that you are allowed to.
Yeah.
And I would encourage you to record it.
Yeah. Heather's just going back to the record keeping thing. Heather's asking, how detailed do we have to be in collecting this information? It seems like an invasion of privacy. Heather, if you're licensed, you have to at a minimum take down their driver's license. I mean, it might spook off a client, but you have to keep a record of who you sold to. So that you need to know the name and address and personal identifying information of the person you sold to. So your way around this, if you're not licensed, you don't have to keep any records. So if you fit the retail pet exemption, you can do whatever you want. But if you're gonna ship a bird from your house to your buyer in another state, you're gonna need to get their identifying information. You're gonna need to get a copy of their driver's license, basically. Fran asks, how are they going to find us if we don't raise our hand and say, come license me? So again, it's one of those things. If you're a big bird breeder like Steve, they're gonna find you. If you're selling to every bird store, on the Eastern Seaboard, they're gonna find you. And that, I mean, let's think about it this way: low-hanging fruit. The first ones are going to be the Steves of the world. The next rung down is probably everyone who sells to a broker. The next rung down is probably all of us who are active on Facebook groups and post pictures of our birds and things like that. But if you're, nobody knows about you and you don't sell, you don't advertise, how they're going to really find you, unless someone rats you out that this person's selling birds, they're not going to find you. But I mean, it really boils down to how vigorous USDA is going to want to enforce this. Are they really going to be looking for people? I mean, look, I'm here advocating for everybody to like band their birds, but all it takes is for them to go and grab birds that are like banded and figure out who's selling the leg band and call the leg bander to be like, who'd you sell that leg band to figure out who's selling birds. So, I mean, there's ways for them to find you. How vigorous they're going to be about it is the $1 million question. They might just say, they might just want to get the Steves and be done with it and be like, that's good enough. We did our job.
I'll be licensed for the rest of you if that's what it takes. Yeah, so there's, as David said, there's a number of ways, but just think about how laws work. You know, if you're driving without a license, how do they catch you? Well, if you violate the law and they pull you over and you don't have your license, guess what? You're getting another citation. So it's kind of the same thing. There's a threat of getting a citation for operating a facility without a license. That's not going to happen probably at least for a year after these regulations are released, because they're going to have their hands full initially anyways. But there's going to be voluntary compliance. I don't have a choice. I'm too big and too obvious, that they know who I am already. So I'll be applying anyways voluntarily. For the people who don't voluntarily apply for a license, how do they find you? Well, as David mentioned, there's advertising, etc. There's a lot of your information is out there. You don't even realize it. But probably the biggest one is just word of mouth. People are going to be turning each other in. It's just kind of a sad commentary on how people work. But trust me, we all know how social media works, right? You post a picture of your bird online and everybody gets after you about, not enough enrichment or everything else. Everybody's a critic. If you're raising and selling birds, somebody is going to know about it. And at some point, somebody's going to call up USDA and say, hey, Joe Blow over here is raising and selling birds. He doesn't have a license. And that's where a lot of it's going to come from.
Yeah. I mean, and if you're really small, like back to the person who's saying, oh, I only sell a couple birds to my local pet store. They might not find you, but if they really want to be, vigorous about it, they'll probably go to the pet stores and be like, tell us where you buy the birds from, and track you down that way. So, again, it's really how vigorous they want to be about it. Adrian is asking, are there potential for changes after the February 22 date? Can we push to write in the comment period after the time? So, Steve, I know what your feeling is going to be on this. I'm going to give a slightly different answer to this. The short answer is no. The final rule is going to come out. That's going to be it. We all have to live with it. I'm obviously the attorney. If there's something egregious in it, I'll probably sue them about it. However, there is another option. It's sort of extreme. It's unlikely to work, and it would have to be very coordinated for this to work. But if there's significant changes, so for example, the de minimis exemption, they've hinted that it might change. If it changes dramatically, there's a rule in the Administrative Procedures Act that says any significant changes need another comment period. And so, I don't think we'd complain if they change the de minimis exemption to $10,000 or something like that. But, if all of a sudden the regulations say, you need, all cages need a red perch, something like that. I mean, that's just a ridiculous example, but it says, something like that came out of nowhere, or as a significant change to what the regulations say, we could do some sort of campaign for a second comment period. That's very unlikely, and we're basically going to have to live with what comes out. The short answer is no. The short answer is no. There's not going to be much of a change. There's much possibility for change.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. I agree with everything you said.
Yeah. Let me see, what else we got here? So Jennifer is asking, is the inspection restricted only to the bird room or the whole property? So, I would argue that you could tell them the facility is this, and draw a line around it. The facility is what's on that side of the fence, or these two rooms. But if they come into your bird room and they see that you're feeding apples, and there's no refrigerator or cutting board in the bird room, they're probably going to say, I need to inspect your kitchen unless you tell me I cut the apples in the garage or something like that. You can limit what the facility is, but you know, if you're breeding out of your house and every room in your house has a bird toy, it has a cage, and has, you know, a feed, they're gonna say, you know, I've got to inspect this whole house because the feed's in the living room, the vegetables in the kitchen, there's birds in these 3 rooms, and the garage is full of bedding. You know, you're gonna have a hard time restricting where they look. So if you want to limit where they look, you need to rearrange your life a little bit so that everything bird is here, and say, yes, this is, I live here and the birds are in the house, but the bird part of the house is this. So you can inspect that and nothing else. So Debbie asks, a lot of us bring our birds into the home to feed. So would the US be coming into home to see the hand feeding setup of those babies? Or are they just viewing the outside breeders? So again, this is what I was just answering. If you're bringing the babies in, they're gonna want to come look at that baby room that you have in the house. Now, can you be not obvious so they don't notice that you have a baby room? Yes. But if they notice you have a baby room, they're gonna want to come see the baby room. So, you know, when you make your adjustments for the USDA, limit where everything is, try to segregate as much as possible. So you can say, my breeding facility is this segregated piece of my property. You can inspect these 1,000 square feet of my property and nothing else. The rest of it is my house. Leave me alone. This isn't about the Animal Welfare Act, but I'm just gonna deal with it. Kelly's asking, can you clarify the ramifications for scarlet owner breeders and nonprofits that may come from a decision regarding scarlet macaws and non subsidies? So that's the ESA. That has nothing to do with the Animal Welfare Act. But I will say the 4D the rule is going to stay in place for the scarlet macaw regardless of whatever happens. So nothing's changing on the scarlet macaw. You can still ship it across state lines, but that has nothing to do with the Animal Welfare Act. That's Fish and Wildlife and the Endangered Species Act. Do you think the requirement would be for retail pet stores, brick and mortar, that ship birds or sell online or over the phone? If you're a retail pet store, if you're an actual retail pet store, if you're Steve Duncan's Birds, or what was your pet shop called, Steve?
Oh, a long time ago, Diamond Reef.
Diamond Reef. If you're Diamond Reef, and you know you have your Amazon in the corner, and someone from Florida says, "Hey, I saw that you posted online that you have yellow nape Amazon, and I want that," and you ship it, and Diamond Reef ships it to Florida, they're now a USDA dealer that needs to be licensed. So if you're an actual brick and mortar retail pet shop and you don't want to be USDA licensed, no shipping birds anywhere. They have to come to the store and buy it. Heather asks, are they going to be understanding of poop in the nest box or poop on the cages, or does everything have to be spotless? So I wouldn't let them in your nest boxes. Don't open their nest boxes for them. Just say, oh, you're going to disturb the breeding birds. There's eggs in there, and that's fine. Again, Steve said this at the very beginning. It's performance-based. So yes, they'll probably be understanding of some poop, but if the poop is of quantities that start to indicate that it's not good for the welfare, I mean, I'll put myself under the bus. You know, I've had a very busy year, and while I was in Panama for CITES, my wife told me, you need to clean out the macaw cages. They got the big tower of poop, and there's some bugs in it and stuff like that. When I came back, I was like, yeah, I definitely needed to have cleaned this out a month ago. That might be problematic. You know, if there's the pile of poop and there's little fly maggots crawling around it, that might be problematic. At the same time, the regulations allow for you to keep them out of your facility if it's breeding season. So, they're going to be understanding of breeding season. And so what you're going to need is like a protocol that says, I don't clean from the month of May to August because it's breeding season. And, the pressure washer might scare the birds off their nest and break their eggs. So you're going to need in your protocols that you develop all this, you're going to need a written protocol that says, breeding usually starts around February. By March, they're on eggs. So I stop cleaning in March, and then they're usually all off eggs by August. So I clean in September. That's the protocol, and they will accept that because it's, as long as it's a written protocol that's relating to husbandry and breeding, etc. So yes, they'll be understanding of poop, but also don't let it get out of control.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's also why you want to put these things in writing in your own facility care plan. But yes, exactly. If there's maggots crawling around and it's really unsanitary looking, they're going to write you up because no vet is going to approve that. But certainly, this time of year, sure, you could make the excuse that you're growing Christmas trees, like those little piles in David's cages. He was in the holiday spirit, creating these little artificial trees in his macaw cages. But, all kidding aside, as long as those little poop towers are dry and not full of insects, the USDA isn't going to come after you for that specifically, provided you have a routine, cleaning protocol written down that your vet approves. And as David said, that may include you don't clean for 6 months of the year because it's acting nesting season and it's too disruptive for the birds. So there's got to be some justification for it. But no, they're going to come after you for every little bit of poop that might accumulate on the bottom of the cage. And that kind of reminds me of another couple of questions I've seen pop up that people have asked if wire bottoms of the cages are now not going to be allowed. And they absolutely are allowed. There's not a problem with having wire bottom cages at all.
Yeah, I think that's coming from the regulation saying that the floors can't sag, but that basically means it can't sag to the point that like the bird might get smushed or something like that. No one who has a standard American style hanging suspended cage has a problem with the bottoms. There are certain regulations about cleaning under the cages. If you're the type of person, so I have gravel bottoms. I spray them down every once in a while, and it all just sort of filters through. But if you have like a concrete bottom, you do have to occasionally sweep and clean under the bottom. Here, Stanley's here asking on the identification issue, if the recipient provides the leg band, will that work for identification? I don't see why not, but it's it's just a little odd, but I don't see why not. In theory, that should be fine. So as far as Janice is asking, as far as the licensing requirements go, what is the difference between breeders that sell retail from their homes and breeders that wholesale or ship birds? So again, if you're selling retail from your home, you don't need a license. You can continue doing whatever you want to do, whatever you've been doing with your life. And none of these, you're not going to need a license. You don't need to meet any of these things that we're talking about. It's when you start wholesaling and shipping birds that you need a license.
Right. The retail exemption, the animal, the buyer, the seller all have to be present in person at the place of business to qualify for that exemption. And that also, David has pointed this out, that the definition of wholesale really isn't spelled out. But typically, if the buyer is coming to your house, meeting all those requirements, but he's buying the bird, and this, he's buying the bird to take it and resell it later, that's a wholesale transaction, even if all three of you are present in the same place. It's really, the retail exemption only applies when it's the end user, the consumer, the pet buyer, or the final owner of the bird is the one who's present.
KG asks, do I have to make a second door in my breeder cages for entry exit, or is one front door suitable? So you don't need two doors on your cages. There is something in there that I went back and forth with Cody with the USDA quite a bit about, because you have to have a system that prevents escapes. And then they provide you a list of things like double doors. And what double doors means is like, you know, if your cage is in a room and the room has a door, there has to be a second door before you go out, kind of thing. So for what the USDA has told us, you have to have a system. The system doesn't have to be double doors. You just have to be has to be a system to prevent escapes. So, for example, when I write up my own plan, I'm going to say my system for preventing escapes is the feeder hatch doors are spring loaded. There's one door to go in to grab the birds, and it's clipped shut every time it's used, and the nest boxes are wrapped with wire to prevent, and that's my system to prevent escapes. And I'll probably include something in there, like saying when I go to take out a bird, I always make sure to have an assistant standing by to help me with removing the bird or whatever. You know, you need to have a system, a protocol for how you prevent escapes. And as long as you have something that you can justify, you should be okay.
Right, and this is somewhat performance-based as well.
Yeah.
If you're not having a problem with birds escaping, right, then your system is working well. But if you're having issues with birds escaping, you're probably going to get written up for it, even if you believe you have a system in place to prevent that. Obviously, you're not achieving that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that comes down to whether or not you're performing to the standards they're asking you to.
Yeah. And that performance is don't let the birds get out. So Steve, this is to change the type of question. I think this one's a good one. Brad Puller is asking, how do you personally plan on bringing your facilities into compliance? Do you have an Excel spreadsheet or sample database you can give us an idea of how we can better keep track of our records and be compliant? I personally already keep a few Excel sheets, but I would love to hear the pros and cons of what you're doing to manage your records. So, I mean, you just built your new facility, so maybe you go first, and then I'll explain what I think I need to do to fix my own place. Yeah,
there's kind of two questions there. What general one about the facility and a more specific one about record keeping.
Yeah.
And you know, the general one about the facilities, I would encourage you to go on the USDA website and look at some of their informational packages they have there that'll help you through this. So, you know, you can go online and download a lot of this stuff, or sort of do a test application yourself. You don't have to turn it in, but you can download all the material that tells you exactly how to comply or bring your facility into compliance. So that's available. And your second question about record keeping, yeah, that's a tough one for a lot of people. I'm a stickler about record keeping. I keep details on every single egg that is laid here and what happens to it henceforth. I'm a little weird that way, but what's also kind of strange is that we don't really have a good record keeping software. I use the good old-fashioned Avimate software. It's been around since the 90s. And I have well over 20 years of data in mine, and it's still plugging along, and I wish there was something better. There are a number of record keeping softwares that I've looked into, and for a facility of my size, because I have a lot of birds, it would, because they tend to charge a subscription fee based upon how many specimens you have. And I've done the math on several of them, and it would literally cost me thousands of dollars a month to be able to have a subscription to some of these zoo record keeping systems. So I use, good old fashioned AvaMate. I think you can still download that from the AFA website, if I'm not mistaken. But you don't have to go that way as well. You can use Excel spreadsheets. You can use 3x5 cards, as long as you have a system in place and can demonstrate that it's effective. When your USDA inspector comes out, then you're going to be in compliance. But that is definitely a challenge for a lot of people, especially if you haven't done extensive record keeping yet, and you're going to have to do it if you become licensed.
Yeah, and I guess I'll give a little details about myself as well. I know what I have to change. My sick room, feed room, and tool room are all the same room. I know that's something I need to change. I've already talked to the handyman about how I'm going to redivide the space and add doors and make sick room over here, feed room over here, tool room over here. I also keep my feed bags on the floor. So I got some pallets the other day. I'm going to stick some wheels on them so I could put the bags on and roll the pallets around with the food, with my food storage around. Just because because you have to be able to move your food away from the wall and sweep under it. You have to have the ability to do that. That's part of their regulations. So I know that's the things I have to change. As for the record keeping, I'm gonna be honest I'm the opposite of Steve. For me, it's always been up here, and I haven't done a good job, I forget, but for a long time it was always just like up here. Luckily I married a wonderful woman who's very anal, and now keeps all my records for me. But it's one of those things. You're at the bird farm. I get why you want digital, Steve, but for me it's I'm at the bird farm, and then usually I'm there all day, and then I come home at the end of the day, and I don't want to sit down in front of a computer to fill it in, and then you forget to do it the next day, and before you know it, it never happened. So at least with my wife, she has a paper log book. She has some sheets that we designed a long time ago, and she fills everything in for me. Every egg I bring, every stuff. All I have to do is write down the notes somewhere. When I bring the eggs for the incubator, I just write it with a Sharpie on the side of the bowl that I brought the eggs in, and she plops it into her paper record keeping. I will say though, paper record keeping is obnoxious, because just from this year, the records are like that thick. So it's not a great system, but you can just do handwritten notes. I mean, just get yourself a college ruled notebook and carry it around with you while you're doing stuff and annotate, and that'll be good enough. No one's gonna fault you for bad handwriting and sweat stains on the notebook. You just need to go through the motions. I'm a big fan of going through the motions. It's just go through the motions, it'll be fine. So I've seen a couple questions about cost. And Debbie's asking me about cost. I have no idea. Steve, do you currently have a vet who inspects who comes out to your facility?
Yeah, well, I have a vet that comes out 3 times a year anyways, and that's the attending vet I'll be using.
Yeah.
Until he retires, which may not be that long from now, unfortunately. But what I would recommend, if getting a vet out to your place is a challenge, which we know it is, remember that it does not have to be an avian specific vet. Any licensed veterinarian can do this for you. And that's still going to be a challenge, right? There's not too many mobile vets out there. The ones I can think of are actually like equine vets that do house calls, because you can't put your horse in the back of the car and take him to the vet's office. So there are vets like that. You might consider striking up a relationship with. And as David mentioned earlier, you're going to want to do all the heavy lifting, do all the writing and everything else. So your vet is just going to be able to take a quick overview of that and say, yeah, that's cool, and sign off on it. As far as what that's going to cost you, of course, it depends on what your vet is going to charge you, whatever vet you find. As far as the charge from USDA, it's not too expensive. I think it is in the $100 range, less than 200 if I'm not mistaken. But it's a fee you're going to pay. But the bigger issue is the cost of your own vet that USDA is going to be requiring you to have.
Yeah. So I got a couple more questions here. I don't know how much longer we want to go, Steve. I know you're probably tired since you got in at 2:30 in the morning.
Are you kidding? I love this stuff. Yeah, we've been going for a couple hours, and I know if we stay here and answer all the questions, we'll be here until the sun comes up again. And so I get it. I think we have a way to copy these questions, and maybe we can get to all the written ones at some point, but we're certainly not going to be able to get to them all tonight. But I think we can take a few more anyways.
Yeah. So I got 3 here that I think are interesting. So Diane, Jason calls. So if my local bird store comes to my house to purchase birds face to face, babies out of the nest for whatever price or whatever end use, we would both be exempt as a retail store. And what if I travel the state to conduct more face to face transactions with other stores? So here's the what's the definition of wholesale? Diane, that probably isn't gonna exempt you from the license, because there's a definition of wholesale out there that says that that you're wholesaling if you're an intermediate transaction. So if the pet store is selling to the end user, you're doing an intermediate transaction to the pet store. So even though you did it face to face, it's probably wholesale. There's other definitions of wholesale that wouldn't define that as wholesale, but I think the USDA is going to go for the more expansive definition that would bring you selling to the pet store as wholesale. Because at the end of the day, you're going to be selling them for $300 and the pet store is going to be selling them for $500. And so not only is it end user, but there's a markup going on. So I think that would make you need a license. Additionally, the whole traveling the state wouldn't be a retail pet exemption either, because the rule says you have to do it out of your home or business. So if you are in Miami and you drive to Gainesville and you sell somebody some birds out of the McDonald's parking lot, that's not your home or business. That's a McDonald's business. And so you're not retail petting either, even though you're doing it face to face. I don't know, Steve, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, that sums it up. The way to think of it is that the USDA is looking for the opportunity for the pet owner or the end buyer to be able to visit the place that the bird is coming from. In this case, it's a retail pet store, and that's good enough. So if just the bird and the buyer and the seller are present in some unknown location, that's probably not going to satisfy USDA's requirements.
Yeah. So Wayne's asking, I've been told that any sort of infraction document by the USDA can be obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, and by animal rights then can use them to sue on behalf of the animal. Is that true? So there's 2 questions there. One, they'll probably will be able to get infraction documents through Freedom of Information, although identifying information will be redacted. So your name might go on there, but any other information wouldn't, and your address is normally redacted. So they might be able to find your infraction info, yes. Can they sue on behalf of the animal? No. There's ways that animal rights groups can sue about that kind of stuff, but they have to sue the USDA directly, and it's not behalf on the animal. that's a very complicated legalese point, but basically, that's called a citizen suit provision. There are certain laws that have citizen suit provisions where an individual can sue a private party on behalf of something the government should be doing. The Animal Welfare Act does not have one of those. Now, there is one case that you've probably heard about of a zoo in like Indiana or somewhere where the animal rights groups sued the USDA because the USDA wasn't enforcing the Animal Welfare Act appropriately against the zoo. But that's really out there. If I remember the law correctly, the judge was very confused about whether they could even do it. I wouldn't worry about that too much, Wayne. I don't think anyone's going to come and sue on behalf of the animals. You really have to. Wayne, I know you. I don't know you too well, but you know you'd really have to piss somebody off for that to be the case.
And I would encourage people to use, a PO box for your mailing address. Your facility is going to be licensed at its physical address.
Yeah.
But any contact information you can run through a PO box, and even if they fail to redact that information, then people aren't getting your actual facility address.
Yeah, and the USDA does actually encourage that. The USDA does understand that animal terrorism is a thing, and they're not supportive of it. So they do encourage you to use addresses to give them addresses that are PO boxes. That's actually what they want you to do. Jacob asks a practical question, which is, I live in a rural area on a private gated road. The USDA won't be able to just show up and announce. What happens if they're unable to see my facility without prior notice? So I would say this, Jacob. We've been giving you a lot. This is all very complicated, but the way to boil this down and simplify it is you need a good relationship with the person who's going to do your inspections, because it's going to be one person and they're going to do it always. You need a good relationship with them. And at the end of the day, they're a tired government bureaucrat. So if they know you, if they know you're not doing terrible things, they're not out to get you. They'll probably be willing to give you a call and be like, hey, Jacob, are you there today? I'm going to pass by at 3. But that's something you have to build a relationship with your officer about. Realistically, though, if they come and they can't get in, they're gonna just keep coming back and trying. They might eventually get pissed at you and tell you, you have to be there, and we're gonna write you an infraction if you're not there. But really, they don't really have the authority to write you an infraction for not being there or not hearing them. But at the same time, if you hear them honking at the end of the road and like actively ignore them, that could, that's not gonna work either. So it's one of those things. You're just going to have to deal with it and figure out how. And I mean, they'll have their phone, your phone number is going to be on your license. So they might just call you, if they're at the gate honking and you're not hearing them, they might call you on the phone. But the best advice I can give you about this is just make friends with your officer when you meet him and try to develop a good relationship with him so that he, if he's there and you're not picking up the phone, he says, hey, I'll come back, Friday at 1, just make sure you're there, kind of thing.
Yeah, they're not going to write you up if they show up and you're not there to let them in. But if they repeatedly try to inspect your facility and you keep brushing them off and never let them in, then they will write you up. So it's, within reason. And as David said, you want to develop a good relationship with your inspector. That will go a long ways.
Yeah.
I wanted to address one by Adrian, who's asking who besides USDA will have access to records, including species cap, location, etc. Will the Freedom of Information Act requests make this a shopping list for thieves or animal rights activists? No, the USDA doesn't keep these records. The USDA wants to make sure that you have the records. So they're going to review the records when they do their inspection, but they don't take those records. So that they don't have them. They can't make them available.
Yeah, Adrian, we're calling them records, but I mean, maybe the better way of thinking is you just need a logbook. You can keep a logbook however you want, but basically they're going to say, when they come out and they say, and they're doing the inspection, one thing they might say is, show me the logbook, and you're gonna have to go and you're gonna pull out the logbook and you're gonna say, look, and you're gonna flip the page, whatever, and you're gonna say, look, see, I inputted something a week ago. I'm using the logbook, and they're gonna go, looks good, and they're gonna move on. Like, they're not gonna photocopy or take it with them. So Chris asked the question: if the vet does a farm visit, does he make sure that all the birds in the facility have been disease tested? No, there's no requirement that you disease test anything. There's no requirement that you vaccinate anything. They're not requiring anything. This is sort of the way to you have to tell them what you do, but they're not going to say, okay, every bird needs a PBFD vaccine or whatever. It's just, and that could be your protocol. If you want to put that much detail into your protocol, every new bird, gets a full panel disease test, you can, but that's not required. Obviously, if there's a bird sitting on the perch and it's clearly got beak and feather, that might be a problem, but they're not requiring you to test anything. And Janice asks, do we still need an FWC for a Florida Fish and Wildlife permit in addition to the USDA license? And yeah, I want to make clear, the USDA is above, well, not above, is in addition to your state regulation. You don't get out of your state regulation just by having a USDA license. So whatever your state does to you, whatever your state requires you, you still have to do it. If there's any conflict between the two, I can't imagine the situation where there would be. But if there's any conflict, if the state requires you to do something that's in direct conflict with what the federal government requires you to do what the federal government requires you to do. That's just basic US law. But you need to have both. As long as they're not in direct conflict, you need to have both. Okay, so here's a good question. Roberto is asking, regarding aviaries that share mesh dividing, can they ask us to change what's already done, or will they want us to apply that only to new aviaries? So I put this in my OPA comment, Steve, and this is something I might sue about depending on how I feel about it. I think they should grandfather old facilities in for stuff like that. But what they've told me is that they're not going to do that past the grace period, which will be like a year, to get everything up in line. So yes, Roberto, if they come to your facility and you have a battery cage with mesh walls and they decide that it's a welfare problem, that doesn't work, they're gonna require you to fix that cage to make it up to their standards before they license you, or you'll get an infraction. They will be generous with you, from at least from the feeling I've gotten from talking to them. They will give you time to do it. Now, if you have a massive facility and they tell you 1,000 cages need to be changed, that will be a very interesting question, and I will happily represent you because I would love to do that lawsuit. But yeah, realistically, Roberto, if they come and they say these 10 cages are not okay, we think it's a welfare problem, they're going to make you change them. They're going to make you change them. They're going to say you have a year to change them, kind of thing.
Well, one thing that might help him in that situation is to have that in his written protocol. These cages have a single wire divider, and the birds that are housed adjacent to each other are not a risk to each other. If they were, you wouldn't house them that way. We know that, but
Yeah.
you need to put that in your protocol. And then that's going to protect you. Well, I shouldn't say that with certainty. That should protect you from issues as long as that's part of your protocol. One way to think about it is you're allowed to put multiple birds in an aviary. It doesn't have to be one pair of birds. You can have a community aviary, and the requirement is that those birds get along.
Yeah.
So what difference does it make if there's a wire divider between them? If they all get along and they're not fighting, and there's no injuries being caused, then you should be in compliance. And, you know, a reasonable inspector is going to look at it that way. But as we all know, it all comes down to the inspector. If they want to cause you trouble, believe me, they're going to find things to cause you trouble with.
So Debbie asks, a lot of us use leg bands that breeders who retired or closed used to use, and they've given those bands to other people instead of throwing them away. Will everyone have to have their own leg bands with their own initials? If you go leg band, there's no requirement as to what has to be on the leg band, other than it has to be an individual indicator. So, you know, you can't just get a leg band that says 1, 2, 3. You can't just get 1,000 leg bands that say 1, 2, 3, 4. But other than that, you can get anything you want on them. So I used to buy open leg bands. I think it was I forget what's the name of the leg band company that closed last year?
L&M?
Yeah, I used to call on them, and they would give me leg bands that just said AA and then started on a random number, and BB and started up. Like, I used to use those. I have a lot of birds that are just BB 837. That's fine. If you want to get, you know, your aviary name, the year, the state, and a number, you can also do that. But really, all you need is for it to start at 1 and then go up from there. That's basically, or 0 if you want to be.
Say the band.
But that's basically it. There's no other requirement for the leg bands or the microchips. They just have to be individually numbered. Okay, so this one's interesting. What if you want to keep your pet birds in your home, but your breeders in another area? Can you restrict inspections to just where the breeding birds are? And this is what I was saying earlier. You know, you should segregate your life. So if you have a pet bird, you know, or several pet birds that are now breeders, and you keep them in your house, I would say yes, those birds don't need to be inspected. You can keep them in your house, but segregate your life. You know, if the pet birds, even if the pet birds eat the same pellet, make sure, you know, you have the bag of pellet that you feed the pet birds in the house, and the bags of pellet you feed to the breeder birds in the garage or whatever. Segregate your life. So you can say, you know, this is the dividing line. You can inspect that room, and that room, but not the rest of the house, kind of thing.
Well, the safest way is if they don't know about your pet birds, they're not going to know to inspect them. That's probably the best way to go. Because, you know, technically, I think they can, if you're a licensed facility and you have some pet birds off to the side, they're going to want to see them. You know, you can make the argument that those are pet birds are not a part of it, but they're still birds you're caring for. So I think your best bet is just basically don't let them know that there's birds in there.
Yeah. So KGS, if you have a breeding pairs that are plucked, might they require you to show vet records that those have been plucked for years? So I went through my lecture a little quickly. The caging requirements say, you know, if there's behavioral issues, that might be an indicator that the cage is inappropriate. So if you have a plucked bird or a plucked pair, what I would recommend to you is when your vet comes out, you point out that plucked pair. And you tell Mr. Vet, you know, I got these birds plucked, or they started plucking years ago, or they pluck when they're breeding, whatever the thing is. They're always like this. And the vet's gonna look at it, and you know, this is where you need to have a relationship with your vet. You know, if you get yourself a crazy vet, they might tell you, oh, we have to run 1 million tests and you have to spray them with essential oils and all kinds of crazy things. Like, you don't want that vet. You want the vet who will look at it and say, plucking is a mystery. You know, have you tried anything? Okay, I get that you've tried, you know, giving them sex or enrichment or whatever, and we're just gonna have to chalk it up to plucking is a mystery. And they'll say, you know, cage 47, plucked, long-term plucked, nothing to be done, you know, and like, so if the USDA comes out and says, oh, you know, if your inspector comes out and says, oh, you have a plucked pair of birds, you have them in a 5-foot cage, maybe you should put them in a 10-foot cage. You can show, no, the vet looked at them and the vet says, you know, plucking is a mystery, you know, that's that, let's move on. And that'll be your defense. Basically, your vet said, I looked at them, I don't think there's anything to be done here to stop the birds plucking, or the birds aren't destroyed their follicles, so, you know, there's nothing to be done. Like, and that's it, move on. So personally, I'm going to get rid of my plucked birds before the USDA comes around because I don't want to deal with it. But if you insist, if you want to keep your plucked birds, make sure you show up to your vet and have it, have them write it down and say that's it. Okay, so Jacob asked, will there be a banding exception for existing birds? I have several hundred finches that have already banded based on families, not unique numbers, as the requirement states. Rebanding and writing records for all these birds would be very time consuming and dangerous for the birds. So I'm guessing what you're saying, Jacob, is that your birds don't have like sequential leg band numbers, that they're just all, these are A's, these are B's. In that case, Jacob, what you're gonna have to do is the little placard rule. It's not an exemption, but basically you're gonna have to put a little placard on the cage. And we're yet to see what the final rules on the placard are gonna say, but basically at a minimum, it's gonna have to say, 2 birds, starfinch, and maybe a little bit more, but basically that'll be good enough. It's just a little placard on it that says 2 starfinches, move on. And you're gonna have to put that on every single cage. And when you change the birds around, you're gonna have to change the placard. You can do like a nursery tag, like those little aluminum tags where you scratch it in. You can put a little whiteboard and write it with a marker, whatever you want, but you're gonna have to have some sort of little tag on the cage that at a minimum identifies the species and the number of birds in the cage.
Yeah, the difficulty on that, comes to, you think of people with zebra finches, they may have hundreds of zebra finches in a colony cage. Budgies, often there's many dozens of pairs or 100 pairs in a big aviary, colony bred, lovebirds same way.
Yeah.
But especially with the finches, it is very difficult to individually mark them. And that is a problem of compliance. And really your only way out of that is that placard. You're simply going to have to put an inventory of what's in that cage. And, it may be 50 zebra finches and you may need to break it down. There's 10 pieds and so many chestnuts, et cetera, but there's got to be some sort of inventory in order to satisfy the USDA requirements. Yeah,
and that's the thing. The little placard may require identifying information, like identifying marks or something like that. So yes, if you have an aviary with 50 lovebirds, they might require you to say 10 lutinos, 10 opalines, 10 creminos. You might have to do that. Again, that might all come down to how anal your officer is. Your officer might be okay with you saying there's 50 lovebirds in this cage, so that's it. But you're gonna have to put at least, the way around it is at least putting a little card on it. What's exactly going to go on the card, we'll see when the final rule comes out. Steve, what do you think? One more and then
yeah, I think we've covered it pretty well. We're not going to be able to answer every question.
Yeah.
But we're doing our best here, and I appreciate everybody's questions too. They're fantastic questions, and we've got a lot of involvement with the session, so it's worked out very well. I don't want to suggest that we do another one anytime soon, but we may need to at some point. But I really appreciate all the questions, but yeah, I think we're going to have to cut it off. So pick a good one.
Yeah.
Pressure's on.
Yeah. I'm trying to find one that's not too much of a repeat.
Right.
Okay.
It's also question 100.
That's true. That's true. We do need to answer one more to make it 100 questions.
All right, let me just scroll up to the top here. If a commenter is What happens if there's not a charge for admission and you do a show or something as an education program, and that education program is just talks that? So the exhibit. So I guess this is about the exhibitor rule, Steve, and I guess just to clarify that, because the exhibitor rule is a little bit confusing. So, and to rewind all the way back to the beginning, for people here, there's other people who need licenses, but for people who are in this video, in this Q&A, you're going to fall into one of two categories if you need a license. You're either a dealer, which dealer means breeder or broker, or you're an exhibitor. An exhibitor is anyone who shows their animals to the public for money. And that money is not profit, it's not like income, it's just any money. So if you do an education program and you just say, just cover my costs, that needs a license. If you do an education program and you lose money on it, you're fine. You don't need a license. If you're just doing it out of the goodness of your heart, you probably don't need a license. But the second someone says, and this is as simple as if you're flying your birds at the park and someone comes up to you and says, thank you for that, I really enjoyed it, here's a tip, and gives you $1, you become an exhibitor that needs a license. So the guy, I'm sure we've all seen him, the guy who walks around with the parrots on his, with the macaws on his shoulder to take pictures with you and or for tips, just because it's fun to see him with the birds. That guy's an exhibitor. He needs a USDA license. And even if it's just, the guy who has the blue and gold and sits on the corner with a hat in front of him, and the bird just says, hey, Polly, to everyone who walks by, and you give him $1 tip, that's an exhibitor. He needs a license. So if you want to take your birds into the public and show them to people, and you don't want a license, you can just never take money, no matter how small. That's basically the rule.
Yeah, we don't know if there's going to be a de minimis, money level applied to that. Simply don't know. Makes sense that there would be, but the way it's written right now, it's as soon as you get money for it, you're an exhibitor.
Yeah, I mean, the way I understand it, Steve, is that the de minimis exemption applies to dealers, but not to exhibitors. So
Right.
exhibitors, $1 is enough to make enough to trigger your.
Yeah, and we did push USDA on that when we saw them at the ASA conference, especially since we had a YouTuber there.
Yeah.
Who makes money off of that and shows his birds, and they were pretty clear that would be covered.
Yeah.
But if you're just doing an educational event and not bringing in any money, that's your exemption. But you're not going to be able to cover costs either.
And I will say the social media aspect of this is fairly settled. There is a court case on it about someone who was USDA licensed for cats tried to say, who wasn't USDA licensed for cats and did social media, said, I don't need a license because I'm only exhibiting through social media. And they said, no, that counts. And actually, this is interesting to me, maybe not to anybody else, but the Hemingway Museum in Key West, Florida, which has the six-toed cats, the Hemingway cats on the property, they're USDA licensed because the USDA sued them because they refused to get a license because they said, we don't exhibit cats, they're just on the museum property. And the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals for the federal court said, no, you're exhibiting the cats because they're part of the museum, and so you need a USDA license. And so they had to get USDA license just for having the cats walking around the museum. So the exhibitor rule is pretty broad. It does bring in a lot of people. So just to wrap up, most of you who have watched this will probably need a license. Although we need to see what the final rule comes out, there might be some new exemptions for people, because I think we have made it pretty clear to the USDA that they're about to require way more people to need licenses than they have the staff to do. But in theory, at least as it's currently written, everyone needs a license. I'm sure they wouldn't like to hear me say that, but that's my feeling on it, is that everyone needs a license.
Well, the language is what it is,
Yeah.
you know, and that's why the regulations need to be written, you know, based upon the aims and goals of the regulation. My personal advice, for what it's worth, again, here's another half a cup of coffee coming your way. If you consider yourself a hobbyist breeder, if you have a few aviaries in your backyard, and you're selling a few birds to the local pet store, and this is just something that's definitely at the hobby level, even though you're probably selling more than that de minimis level, you know, I wouldn't rush out and get a license. That's my advice, right or wrong. USDA isn't going to be coming right after you. And certainly there's going to be a certain grace period and a certain implementation even beyond that before they're going to get down to what anybody would reasonably consider to be a hobbyist level. They're definitely going to require me to be licensed. In large commercial facilities, they will be going after. You know, but chances are, if you consider yourself a hobbyist, even if you are selling $1,000 or $2,000 or $10,000 worth of birds a year, you know, they're not going to be coming after you right away. But even if they do, there's going to be a grace period. You're going to be allowed the opportunity to apply for that license and get it. And as soon as you apply for that license, you're basically bringing yourself into compliance. They're not going to hit you with huge fines unless you're very obviously a commercial dealer. So that's, again, my advice, half a cup of coffee. It's about what it's worth. But that should give you some framework to approach this with. I hope that helps some people out.
Yeah, and I mean, it's what Steve said is good practical advice. Is it legally correct? No. Is it good practical advice? Yes. You know, look, I got 100 pairs, and honestly, the reason I know I have to get licensed is because I sell to a broker, and my broker is gonna ask me for my license once this comes into effect. If you know, if at a minimum you're selling to a broker, you know, if you have enough birds that you don't sell every single one of them yourself to a pet person, you know, you're gonna need a license. I mean, there's just no way around it, because it's not the USDA per se is gonna come. Is the USDA gonna come knock on my door and find me? Probably not. But I'm selling to someone who they would go look for, and that's how it's, and he's gonna need my USDA license for him to buy from me. So that's just how it's gonna trickle down. And I mean, you know, if you're outside that market, you could probably get away with it. And if you do get, and if they don't get away with it, when they do come, you know, as long as you're not making $100,000 a year on your birds, you know, you can play dumb and say, oh, no one told me. No one told me. I didn't know I needed this. You know, I'm sorry. I'll do it right now. Kind of thing. You know, that's you know, that's that. So I appreciate that so many people came on. I was honestly a little surprised. I think we got up to around 60 people at one point. So I think I marked this as a success, right, Steve?
Yep, absolutely. I think it worked out great, and appreciate everybody's great questions and involvement. And yeah, we'll move forward from here and see how it goes. You know, kind of unfortunately, we have to wait to see what the final regulations say before we know more than what we know right now.
Yeah, and where is this? I'm going to put up my contact info for the last couple of, you know, as we say goodbye.
I'm not going to put mine up. That's okay.
in case anyone wants to contact me, feel free to.
So you
Send
could
me
probably
an-
find me anyways.
yeah, send me an email, give me a call, call me, text me if you have a specific question you're interested in getting an answer to. I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. What did I do? Did I do it? Oh,
Yep, it's up.
yeah. Okay, I can't tell. Okay, guys. Well, thank you everyone for coming. We appreciate your time and have a good evening.
Yep, thank you very much. Take care.